Well, Inger Andersen is the Undersecretary General of the United Nations and Executive Director of the UN Environment Program. Inger Andersen, welcome to the Climate Pod.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
Well, the UNEP released 3 reports in the weeks leading up to COP26: the Production Gap Report, the Emissions Gap Report, and the Adaptation Gap Report. Let's begin with the Production Gap Report since it was released first. What was that report?
So that report looks at how much hydrocarbon are we really going to produce? And if that's what we're going to produce, how does that square off with what we've said we're going to land on in our NDCs? Or where will we then land in terms of climate? And there, it didn't look so good. Why? Because countries are projecting a 240% increase in coal, a 70-some% increase in oil, and a 50-some% increase in gas. Or maybe it's the other way around. The bottom line is that it's quite a lot of increase in hydrocarbon, and that is not sustainable in any way, shape, or form. And so we looked at the biggest countries that were the biggest hydrocarbon producers. So it's not 193 countries, it's some 15 countries, and we published these numbers. That's important to understand. While we get that these countries are today hydrocarbon exporters, this is well known, we have to now look at what are they going to do to decarbonize. And that's what the first report highlights.
And obviously, the burning of those fossil fuels creates the CO2 emissions that are warming the planet. The UNEP released the Emissions Gap Report just prior to COP26. So what was the Emissions Gap Report?
So the Emissions Gap Report, now this year is a year when all countries have submitted these NDCs, these national determined contributions, this promissory note that we promised back in Paris that 5 years after, now it's 6 because of COVID, we're going to show how we're going to stretch even more our ambition for both mitigation and adaptation. And so we took these reports that had been delivered to our friends at the Climate Change Convention Secretariat, and we added it all up and we look at, okay, so this is what you say you're going to do in terms of the stretch, and this is what it looks like versus if you were heading to 1.5, that's the gap between these two, and this is what it looks like if you're heading to 2 degrees. So here's the math, right? So we emit about 55 gigatons. Let's not get lost in the nerdy giga and so on, but 55, remember that, 55 of this gigaton. And what was it that these NDCs, all of these NDCs said they were going to reduce? 4 gigatons. Now, that will take us to 2.7 degrees at 2100. So that does not compute. Now, then we said, okay, well, many countries after they had submitted their NDC, they've come out at the heads of state level, at the government level, whatever, and said, actually, we're going to go net zero by 2050. These promises are vague, they're not delivered formally, but we said we take you on face value. We take these promises as well. We calculate what does that mean, even though it mixes up greenhouse gases and CO2. One is more comprehensive, includes a number of other gases, and one just a carbon dioxide. So we took that, and that lands us at 2.2 degrees, but with a lots of sort of nota benes, right? A lot of ifs and buts. Then during the conference, some additional NDCs came in. So we spent a night or two recalculating, because there was a lot of fanfare around these additional NDCs that were delivered. And what was the additionality? It took us from 4 gigatons. Remember, we needed to get to 55 to 4.8. So essentially, when we project out to 2100, there is no difference in temperature. We're still at 2.7 and still at the 2.2 if we take on board the net zero.
Well, and the Washington Post released their own findings earlier this week that emissions might actually be underreported by as much as 23% by countries. What did you make of that report?
Well, of course, I mean, we work with the numbers that we have. And so I think it's very important that countries are as clear and as detailed as possible as they can be in their NDC reporting. So obviously that's something that when we are less rushed right now, we are going to look at. We want to make sure that those numbers that we do get are real. I'm very confident on the production gap side because this is from published numbers from oil companies and countries that it's their reports. So there can be no differential. But we're obviously going to look at it. Irrespective though, I mean, not irrespective, that's the wrong word, but 2.7, even if our numbers are right, that's not good enough. If and they are right, if because this is based on the numbers that countries have reported in. If countries have underreported, then the climate catastrophe is even worse, which means that we have to act to decarbonize our economies right now. Promises are easy, but it is about translating that into action. Not what you're going to do in 2030 and 2050, but what you're going to do in 2022 and how we are putting money against that promise to make it happen.
Yeah, these NDCs are clearly less ambitious than they need to be. In your opinion, what are some of the biggest areas or actions that are missing or just inadequate in these NDCs?
Well, there are some countries that have stepped up and made very ambitious NDCs. And let's call out some of them, right? The Pacific Islands, small island, low-lying developing states, they've done their very best. But look, they're not the big carbon emitters. They are the victims of climate change to a large extent. But when Tuvalu tells us that they're going to go carbon neutral, good for Tuvalu. So I think but that's obviously not going to make the difference. The G20 countries, these 20 largest economies, of which the US is one, emit together, just these 20 countries, 78% of all CO2, so of all carbon emissions. So if we want to have an agreement, you cannot get there unless these 20 economies have the required ambition. So that's where the ambition needs to happen. And that is where the action needs to happen. Now, these G20 countries are in two categories, right? There are some that have a historical carbon trail behind them. These are the wealthier countries. And then there are others that are more they are developing or they are newly emerging economies that have less historical responsibility. And under the Paris Accord, there are differences in terms of how they should stretch. But at this point, look, we are asking from the UN side that everyone steps in and everyone does the very best. And the 20 largest economies must do this, or we will not land where we need to get to.
But quite frankly, those G20 countries just haven't stepped up yet. And we know these NDCs are plans. Based on what countries have actually done recently, how confident are you that the countries will actually execute the NDCs as they've promised?
Well, it's my job to push and push and push and hold up the mirror and shout from the mountaintop and ensure that people like yourself and media and everyone has the data, that it is transparent, that it is out there. Because I have to be confident, because we cannot leave the world at a 2.7 degree in 2100. I will be dead, but our next generation and the next thereafter will inherit this. So the fact that the G20 countries are not where they need to be means that you've heard the Secretary General of the United Nations speak to an existential crisis, to code red. So we need to really push to make this happen. We've seen some good things here in Glasgow, including the Methane Pledge. We have to understand that methane, this CH4, this gas that is a greenhouse gas, it has an 84 to 85% potency of CO2, but it lives much shorter time. It has like 10, 12 years of life. It's a short-lived greenhouse gas, whereas the CO2 can live for hundreds of years in the atmosphere. So if we bring down that very potent gas, we can get a head start while we decarbonize our economy. So I'm happy about that. And we at UNEP, we got funding for establishing an international methane observatory with satellite and so on. So we will now every year publish numbers around these these methane leaks. Methane comes from three sources: oil and gas and coal infrastructure, which of course we need to decarbonize, don't get me wrong, but meanwhile, we need to not have methane leak from it. It comes from food waste and it comes from agriculture. We need to push on all three. But yeah, confidence, I could do with more.
What do you think is keeping countries from actually executing on these NDCs?
Interests. I mean, I think I have to be very honest. Hydrocarbon interests, fear of stepping into the new economy, the new low carbon economy. Look, the countries that have stepped up, and let me mention one, for example, Morocco, right? 10 years ago, Morocco said, look, we are an oil importer. This is when oil was at the all-time high. Morocco then decided to invest $1 billion in solar energy because they could sort of see that this was going to be a real burden on their economy, as well as, and a permanent one, because they would constantly have to import, whereas Morocco does have very high solar radiation for obvious reasons. So they invested in this and sort of are now a significant producer of solar energy. Kenya, the country where we, United Nations Environment Program, are based, similarly invested 10, 15 years ago in geothermal. They sit on the African Rift, where you have amazing geothermal capacity. They have high solar radiation, so big solar, and obviously wind on the coast. So they are also moving in that direction. Bigger economies have to do the same. But they need to set the regulatory guardrails, right? Government regulations, taxation on the hydrocarbon side, and incentives to move everybody over. That's the way to make this thing happen.
The adaptation report was released during the first week of COP26. What did that report conclude?
Well, I'm afraid I'm sort of the bearer of consistently not very good news here, Ty, but I'll say at least there's a little bit of positive news. So so this trilogy, the production gap, the emissions gap, and the adaptation gap, right? And here we looked at, okay, I should say the Paris Agreement says that adaptation and mitigation should be held in balance. And the Secretary General takes us to understand in equal terms of financing. And of course, the more we delay on bringing down our carbon emissions, the higher the adaptation bill will be. The more floods, the more droughts, the more fires, the more inundations, et cetera, and with greater frequency and greater intensity. So the adaptation report looks then at, okay, if this is the trajectory in terms of climate change beyond 1.5 or even at 1.5, because we're living at 1.1, 1.2 now, and we're seeing these frequency and intensity weather events already, then what is the gap in terms of money? And I think we understand that to finance low-income countries, we need about $79 billion of finance. We got about $79 billion of finance in 2019, but we need about, by 2030, we need around between 150 and $300 billion per year. And by 2050, it's around 250 to $500 billion a year. So we measure them and see, okay, how much money is on the table now? Not enough, so that's a gap. Plus, we also look at who has integrated adaptation into their national plans and got adaptation plans in place. And there's a little bit of good news here, because 71% of the NDCs tell us that we have at least sort of one adaptation action in place. Maybe it's funded, maybe it's not. But that means that countries are beginning to understand the reality that is hitting us already now at 1.2, 1.1 degrees climate change, and therefore that we cannot wait. We need to make these actions happen right now.
Well, clearly, as that report suggests, we need to increase financing for adaptation. But coming into COP26, what were some other of the biggest things that you were hoping to see agreed upon in Glasgow?
But we're still hoping because we're not over yet, we're not done yet, and it will not be done until the gavel goes down. But clearly, there's something referenced as Article 6, which you know, it's the Paris rule book. This, after we agreed Paris, well, how is Paris going to be implemented? So there's this Paris rule book, and the piece that hasn't quite fallen into place is Article 6 that deals with the rules for Article 6, which deals with carbon markets. It's very nerdy, very technical. So I won't bore the listeners with that, but I would say that essentially it will allow for money to flow to countries, and it will allow for a carbon tax kind of dimension that will allow for these emitters to, well, they would have to pay for those emissions. That will obviously incentivize them to reduce, but the monies will go into poorer countries in a very complex mechanism. Now, there we walked into this meeting with over 400 square brackets. A square bracket means that this text hasn't been agreed upon by everybody, that somebody has said, I don't agree on this. And I think yesterday, we're down to a lesser degree, maybe 200 square brackets. And then last night came out a new text, still has some brackets and still has some work to be done. But we're pushing that the Article 6 rule book element on the carbon markets has to be agreed. Similarly, on the dimension of loss and damage, that's sort of a technical term for, okay, but we didn't cause this, but we're suffering this, so how can there be a transfer of resources? It's kind of connected to the carbon market dimension, and yet not. These two things, at least the carbon markets, we are very much wanting that to land. It also means that we sort of transfer from an older mechanism called the clean development mechanism into this new thing that would be established under the Paris Accord. That's a dimension. And of course, financing. Back in COP 10. Anyway, in 2000, no, it was 15, wasn't it? Yeah, back in COP 15 in Copenhagen, 2009. It was not a good COP. There were many, many disasters associated with it. But the one thing that we did agree on, or the vast majority of countries agreed on, was by 2020, there shall be $100 billion on the table for developing countries to meet their needs on adaptation and mitigation. And we have not reached this, and it is really unacceptable that 12 years later, it's not like we were not given fair warning. We agreed on this back in Copenhagen, and today we do not have, we have around $80 billion on the table dispersed last year, and we need to, and of course, inflation, etc. It's no longer 100 billion, it's more, and certainly 100 billion is the floor, not the ceiling. So that drives what we refer to as a trust gap and as a leadership gap. And developing countries are saying, look, why do you ask us to decarbonize when you're not helping, giving us a helping hand? Understand this, many countries do not have 100% access, and many households still waiting to be connected to the electric grid. And so clearly, if they need to meet that with new and modern technology, there's an associated increased cost. They need to find that element of that increased cost from somewhere, and it has to come from the climate finance. So these are the things: carbon markets, finance on the table, adequate funding for mitigation, and obviously a stretched level of ambition.
Well, you mentioned the trust gap, and that seems to be big and getting bigger. I mean, there have been plenty of complaints that these are just pledges without any repercussions if they aren't followed through. Are these pledges simply more of the same that we've seen in previous COPs, or should we expect them to be different this time?
Well, I think that here, I don't think that pledges are more than words until they have been given action. So any pledge that are made in any COP is but a pledge until the action has been delivered. So, but it's our job at the UN to then say, this is what you promised. And so last year and the year before last, because we skipped the year, in Madrid, it was a Chile hosted COP. the emissions gap projected 3.5 degrees in 2100. Now we are at 2.7. It's not good enough, but we're seeing a little progress. We're seeing also that, frankly, markets are doing, I mean, the price of solar, the price of renewable is just happily dropping because there's more uptake. So pledges are good, yes, but delivery is what it is all about. And that's what we need to see now. We obviously in a COP, what you see are not the actions, you see the words, but they have to be followed by action, and the faster, and we need to go much, much, much faster. I do think though, and I don't want to put the burden on young activists because this is not fair, but I do think, and I am very grateful to climate activists for raising awareness and for pushing relentlessly and for holding to account, myself included, because that's the only way, right? And I do think that climate change is such an existential issue that more and more people who otherwise might not be environmentally inclined, but they've seen the harvest fail, they've seen the waters recede, they've seen the glaciers disappear, they've seen things change, that more and more people are getting more and more concerned. And that means that climate change, it's in the classroom and in the cafeterias, but it's also over dinner tables, and it's also in boardrooms, and obviously in parliaments, and it is very much walking into the voting booth. And I think that that's something that will make politicians listen more than most. And so, yes, there are promises, but I think we'll see more and more intense action because people will hold decision makers to account.
Well, this pandemic has provided an example of the need for greater global cooperation. Yet, as we've seen with vaccine inequities, the richest nations have not fulfilled their moral obligations to less developed nations. What do you think can be learned about global cooperation from this pandemic?
Well, you know, we United Nations Environment Program, our headquarters are in Kenya, and I have had a front row seat to vaccine inequity, right? Because Kenya did not have access to vaccines, and the rich countries have been hoarding that vaccine plenty times more than what their population numbers were. And you go, why? You know, because if you have COVID, we all have COVID. If I have COVID, we all have COVID. Well, here's a news flash. If I have climate change, you have climate change. It's sort of, that's how it works. So it is a sad commentary on the lack of understanding of the interconnectedness of the world. However, as countries have rolled off all these stimulus packages, and in fact, the emissions gap report highlights this, there was an opportunity of these, $15 trillion that rolled off the out of parliaments, largely in wealthy countries, of course. Now, a huge part of that went for, you know, checks into people's pockets, which were critical to stave off, you know, unemployment and people losing their homes and so on. And a lot of it went into health, but about $2.5 trillion or so went into the potentials for greening. And then we didn't use it. We didn't attach green strings to the kind of money that we used for stimulus. So on the one hand, a disappointment in global solidarity, and on the other hand, come on, people, we borrowed all this money from the next generation. The next generation does not have this money, so that is debt that the next generation will have to pay off, these $15 trillion. And then are we going to leave them also a broken planet? I hope not. So I think the lessons are that we need to understand that the intergenerational injustice that we are doing is one that we cannot, that cannot be persevered, because we must break this. And I hope that as we understand our dependence on one another from COVID, I think the penny is slowly dropping now, because now, you know, Europe is seeing a resurgence, and I believe the US too, as we head into the winter months. And people know that there can be new variants out there. We're all talking about Delta, but who knows what comes after Delta. And so understanding global solidarity is the only way, and that will be the only way for climate too.
We are talking on late Thursday afternoon. COP is technically supposed to be winding down. You mentioned that you'll be working until that gavel drops. Do you expect that negotiations will continue past today? And if so, how long do you think they might go?
Well, you know, I don't have a crystal ball, but I think that there will be some late nights ahead. Yeah.
Well, I know you are extremely busy all the time, working with 193 countries to literally protect the environment and all of humanity. But you are especially busy this week with COP26 happening right now. So I greatly appreciate your time talking to me. Inger Andersen, thank you so much for joining the Climate Pod.
Thank you so much, Ty, and thank you for all that you do to make climate real to so many people.